Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, we're going to be doing a deeper dive into administrator protection on Windows 11, which is something that we teased and talked about last week in some of the security improvements that we've made in Windows. And so we're going to dive into that, talk about it, see how it's configured. And then we're also going to talk about multi-tenancy in the unified SOC with Sentinel. So if you are one of those companies that use Sentinel and you have multiple workspaces, maybe you have an M&A and you have multiple tenants that you have to manage, then this is the podcast to listen to. And before we get started, since we are going to be talking about Microsoft, let's give our standard disclaimer.
Yeah, let's do it. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. This show is not sponsored or funded or editorial controlled by Microsoft. We do this on our own time outside of work, and we self-fund the show. So as always, we like to make our listeners aware we do work for Microsoft and, of course, want to stay in the good graces of our employer. However, we get to talk about what we want on this show. And so we are going to cover things from an academic lens, the facts, what this does, where there's value, why you might want to use it. But ultimately, I think our listeners should know, of course, who signs our paychecks in our day job and if that could, fair or not, influence how we talk about something. So yeah, on with the show.
And what's funny is both of these things that we're talking about today were announcements that I actually missed. And so some people think that because we work for Microsoft, we have some sort of insider track and we find out the things that are coming out, before you do. But in reality, a lot of times when they're publicly announced, or maybe shortly before they're publicly announced, we might get a heads up. We have tons of internal meetings with our product managers where they're updating us on roadmap and everything. But there's so many things, as you well know, with Microsoft security that some of these little improvements just get missed. And so these were both things that I actually missed on the initial announcement. So we're diving into them and yeah, we'll learn more about it together. So administrator protection on Windows 11. It is a new security feature, and essentially it is a just-in-time administrator privilege. So very much like any type of just-in-time elevation, similar to maybe Bastion or the Entra P2. Adam, help me out here, and I can't remember the feature for Entra now.
Well, you're talking about privileged identity management.
Privileged identity management.
PIM,
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, it's local administrator escalation on Windows 11. So really cool stuff. And what it does is it requires a user to verify their identity with Windows Hello before you require any admin privileges for different actions. And that could be like installing software, changing system settings like time or the registry, or accessing sensitive data. And so the way it works is the user is issued a deprivileged user token when they sign into Windows. When admin privileges are needed, Windows will then request the user to authorize. And once the action is authorized, Windows will use a hidden system-generated profile-separated user account to issue an isolated admin token. That token is issued only to the requesting process, and it is destroyed once the process ends, which means that the admin privileges do not persist. And one of the key things in that long jargon that I just said was profile separation. This administrator protection uses a hidden system-generated profile-separated user accounts. And so that ensures that any type of actions that are scoped to the user level, maybe malware, that's user-level malware, they can't actually get into that separate security boundary. It's a separate security boundary. So that's one of the key design features of administrator protection. There's also no auto elevation. So every single time that the user needs to authorize an admin operation, the user will have to go through the authorization with Windows Hello for Business. And this makes sure that you're in full control. And the integration with Windows Hello for Business, or Windows Hello in general, I should say, enhances that security. So key nuance there, it is not just something that's available just for businesses. As I was testing this, I enabled it. So let's talk about configuration, because I actually enabled it on my personal PC. So there are multiple ways to configure it and turn it on. You can go into the Windows security settings eventually. That's not available today, but there is a Windows security, like within the GUI settings, that you can go in, and administrator protection under user accounts will be there as a toggle that you can just turn on. But two ways that are available today, if you're on the most up-to-date Windows version, is via group policy or via MDM, like Intune in the settings catalog, which very much mirror a lot of the GPO settings. But for me, I just went into my, I have Windows 11 Pro that's running on my personal machine that I'm recording on right now. I went into the group policy, the local group policy, went into the Windows security settings and found the GPO, which we'll link in the article in the show notes for you. But I went in there and just turned it on, and there was no reboot required. Turned off my machine last night, turned it back on. I don't notice anything different, and I actually haven't tested it, so we're gonna test it right now and see.
This is a real-time testing on the Blue Security Podcast.
Well, it did not actually prompt me for Windows Hello, which is interesting. So I'll have to test it further and actually see if I can get it to work. But I was able to turn it on in the GPO settings, toggle that, and let's take a look.
Where is this at in the support lifecycle? Is this generally available? Is this still public preview?
I believe it's still in preview. Yeah. I will have to test this further and see if I can get it to work, because just testing, I just launched Group Policy Editor. I launched the command prompt as admin, and it did not ask me for Windows Hello. But you know how it is. Sometimes you just do some testing. And that happens.
You gotta bang on it a little bit first. Did you reboot your device?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay.
Started from scratch. So
we have a tech community blog from the Windows IT Pro blog we will put in the show notes. Is there a documentation, a Microsoft Learn document on this too?
Yeah, we can probably find
See
that
if we can find
put
that.
it on it. Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if that's there yet. So definitely something to be aware of, and certainly brings additional value. This to me looks like it is leveraging some of the same engineering effort that was done for Intune EPM. What's EPM stand for? Geez, we're going back and forth on our acronyms now.
Yeah.
Endpoint Privilege Management. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Intune Endpoint Privilege Management. So that is the ability to run apps. Like, let's say you have a certain app that only works if you run it as admin. So you want your users to normally be a regular user function, but you have this line of business app that somebody wrote 20 years ago and you still use, and it assumes that everyone has full admin privilege because it was written in 2020 or 2005. Tune EPM is a great way to do that, and it works very similarly to what Andy has described here, where when you run that app, it doesn't run as like your user profile as an admin. It actually spins up a whole separate profile, separated user account that doesn't have access to any of the underlying user data, and it's destroyed as soon as you close the app. So it sounds like here, if I'm reading the tea leaves, Andy, and Microsoft has gotten way better at doing this. If we've already invested the engineering effort to create this, can we port that over to more use cases? And it sounds very similar, because EPM works in exactly the same way. And when I've talked about EPM with customers, occasionally we run into issues where their application, that line of business app, assumes it has ability to access all of the user profile data. And in this case, when they run it with EPM, it starts up as a blank slate, tabula rasa, if you will, to where they don't have access to that ongoing like save state, and have had to explain that's by design. That's for security purposes, because that way, if you have any malware running, like you talked about, in the user account, and now that account becomes elevated to admin, it doesn't all of a sudden have the ability to wreak havoc on the system. And same idea here, when you're elevating to do admin privilege to perform an activity in some of these different use cases, like changing the registry as an example. So that's, if you're a student of computer history and you study Microsoft as an example, one of the ways Bill Gates liked to run the company is he actually loved having multiple parts of the company working on the same thing, almost like an internal bake-off, where who can create the best technology and they can duke it out, and then the best technology will always win. Well, of course, there are issues with that where you have duplication of effort. You're not always building upon existing technology stack and building things in a sensical way. And modern Microsoft, thankfully, doesn't work that way anymore. It's much more focused on how can we leverage and reuse the architectural underpinnings we've already created and use them in more places. And so it sounds like that's what this is here. So the great news is this is tried and true. This is already generally available from an Intune EPM perspective. It's been deployed at many enterprise customers. It's very successful, very secure. And now it's like, well, what are some more places we can use this? And hey, let's integrate it with Windows Hello so that we can do that real seamless, easy authentication before we allow access to this thing. And Andy, I don't think you said this out loud, but you have in our rundown, this should not be confused with UAC, famous user access control, which debuted in Windows Vista, much derided, although it's obviously gotten a lot better today. Those are complementary technologies. So really defense in depth here, where if a UAC prompt hits and you didn't request it, of course, we all know to say, nope, I didn't do that. This builds upon that as well. So they're complementary. It does not replace that. And one final thought, Windows Hello ESS, enhanced sign-in security, has been in the news recently. This is a feature that ships with every Copilot Plus PC, but has been around prior to that as well. And it's where there's a hardware root of trust from any biometric device all the way through, and protects any messaging that's happening over any buses or anything between, say, a facial recognition camera and the underlying system and the Microsoft Pluton security coprocessor, so on and so forth. And that is required to be used with technologies like Windows Recall, which, remember, there was a lot of hullabaloo about and now is actually coming on market. And of course, nobody's talking about because it is secure and it is safe. And it leverages Windows Hello ESS as its underlying tech. And so this is something where you could take advantage of that as well, where you can have absolute confidence that what's being passed from the biometric sensor all the way through is actually that person. And we want that person to be able to elevate, perform this administrative function, and then we will destroy the admin token and they go on as a deprivileged user. So pretty cool stuff here. Again, read the blog post we're going to have in the show notes and try it out in your environment. And keep an eye on it because this is a nice extra layer of security and we'll all benefit from this. And again, the Windows team certainly gets derided when there's security issues, but we can also give them a little applause here. David Weston and his team have done a great job upping the game of Windows security as of late. And I think Windows 11 in particular is really starting to build a great enterprise story where there's a lot of enterprise capability here. And if you haven't made the jump, again, you've got the October deadline that you have to meet anyway, but I think you're going to get a lot of additional security value by doing it too.
Yeah, so I found some additional information, and I remember we did talk about this last week. It is only available for the Windows 11 Insider build 27.774 or later. And I'm not on an Insider build, so I think there's actually another GPO setting. While under the configure type of admin approval mode, there is the administrative protection already in my GPO settings. There's another thing that actually talks about choosing Windows Hello as the authentication method and to prompt for credentials. And that's not in my GPO settings now. And so I think only on the Insider build are you going to have that ability to actually, I can choose administrative protection, but it's not actually, there's no section to like say prompt for secure desktop. And so I don't think it's actually doing that quite yet.
They built out some of the GPOs in the build you have installed, but it doesn't turn anything on yet. The underlying code is either commented out or not there yet.
Yep.
Got it. Well, that explains why it didn't work.
Yeah. So you do have to be on the Insider build, and then hopefully you have that GPO setting that you can turn on, or if you want to do it through Intune or MDM. So,
which also answers my question: is this generally available? No, not yet. But you can go Insider and you can try it out. And
yeah, that's another thing is that like by default, it's still like I had to actually switch it to administrative protection in the GPO, and it's not turned on by default. But I do think at some point, this could be one of those things, especially with SFI. I mean, if you have Windows Hello enabled and you have a PIN, I mean, instead of clicking yes, you have to then put in a PIN each time you make an admin change or something like that. I could see this being something that we turn on by default at some point.
I think that's a fair assumption. You mentioned SFI, which for our listeners and viewers is the Secure Future Initiative, which is this multi-year security engineering sprint inside of Microsoft. And two of the core tenets of that are secure by design and secure by default. It is not hard to imagine a future feature release of Windows 11, perhaps one coming out this fall. I don't have any inside information, so don't read into that. I'm just speculating. They come out in the fall, tend to at least. It's not hard to imagine that a new, fresh, out-of-the-box build of that would have this enabled by default. I don't know anything. I'm just speculating right along with our listeners and viewers, but just saying, if that's your goal, secure by default, secure by design, that would be another way to harden the system and ship it as a default. Now, for any systems you already have deployed, they wouldn't take on that default. You would have to turn it on. So that helps up the security game over time, but also respect what enterprises have done and respect their existing settings and their existing footprint. So that feels like a best of both worlds approach.
Okay, so moving on. Multi-workspaces for Sentinel has been around for a while. So there is a workspace manager within Sentinel if you need to manage multiple workspaces. And that's important because for a single workspace, you can only have one Sentinel instance. So that's, for organizations that might be geographically spread or different departments, they want to monitor their own data, so on and so forth. Having multiple workspaces to send your data and not having to transfer data back and forth and double pay for that data is important. And so managing multiple workspaces, that workspace manager has been around in Sentinel. And also a solution called Azure Lighthouse has been around for a while. And that's really was designed for MSSPs to get into their customer's environment and manage different Sentinel instances from there. So if I have a managed security service provider and I have multiple customers and I need to manage that, you can use Lighthouse to have RBAC controls for that MSSP into your environment without having to give them an account within the environment. They use their Lighthouse instance, and there's a specified way to get in there, give them RBAC controls, and then you can revoke those controls at any time if you decide to go with another MSSP. But what I missed was, and again, this is some cool stuff. Last August in 2024, there was actually an announcement that announced that multi-tenants with a single workspace was in preview. And so that has been in preview for a while. And when we say tenants, and this is something that I think is a conceptual thing that a lot of people have problems understanding. But when we say tenant, we mean intra boundary. So intra, your identity that signs into an Azure or an M365 tenant is the boundary. So when you have a whole nother identity in a separate area that you have to sign into, that would be considered a whole nother tenant. So multi-tenants with a single workspace, so funneling that data into a single workspace, was available in preview. And then just recently we announced in preview, so I think literally last week or a couple weeks ago, we announced that multi-workspaces and multi-tenants are now in preview. And that UI is built into our unified SOC experience within the security.microsoft.com portal. And so really cool stuff for organizations who need to manage multiple Sentinel instances. Maybe you're doing M&As. This is a really easy way to pull that data in. You don't have to even siphon it into a single workspace. You can do multiple workspaces, multiple different tenants. And the alerts and incidents will all funnel into that unified SOC experience. And there's going to be 2 new columns as you onboard these tenants. And there is a specific way. We'll link that documentation in the show notes for you to walk through. But you have to link, onboard those tenants, onboard those workspaces to your security, your unified SOC. And once you do that, there'll be multiple new columns. One of them will show you, as you walk through the incident, it'll show you, with incident name, the sources and everything. But also it'll have a column for tenants, and it'll also have a column for workspace. So you can know which tenant and which workspace that alert is coming from. And it does maintain those tenant boundaries, so the data doesn't actually move into your different area. All you're doing is reading that data in a unified SOC so that you can see all that, which is really neat. And also there's continuing bi-directional sync. So any changes made within the unified SOC portal will be reflected in Microsoft Sentinel in the Azure portal and vice versa. So if you make a change there, it'll come back and be reflected in the unified SOC experience. In advanced hunting, you'll also be able to explore all of your security data in a single place. There's a panel that'll fly out where you can select the different tenants and workspaces. And then for investigation and hunting purposes, you can then query all your data from all your workspaces, running queries across multiple workspaces, multiple tenants, and there's going to be a new workspace operator that you can use within your query if you want to, narrow it down. There was some speculation that Azure Lighthouse was possibly going away because of this, but that is absolutely not true, because Azure Lighthouse is actually required and supported to gain access into the Sentinel data in other tenants' workspaces. So the technology is built on Azure Lighthouse in order to gain access. So you're still going to need to configure that. And again, like I said before, the data boundaries are maintained so that each of your workspaces will only be synced with its own data. So really cool stuff here for multiple tenant organizations, multiple workspace organizations, to be able to manage all of that from a single pane of glass, if you will.
What's not to like here? This is awesome. And it goes to the point I just made when we were talking about the administrator protection in Windows 11, how Microsoft has done a better job of leveraging existing technology that is, or architecture that's proven. And so instead of Lighthouse going away, this builds on Lighthouse, actually is required for this, which is great because Lighthouse is really good and does what it does really well. And Andy mentioned Lighthouse, of course, primarily for MSSPs, but if you run a multi-tenant environment, you can use it too. There's no requirement. You don't have to be in the partner program or anything to take advantage of it. And Lighthouse is for more than just Sentinel. It's for managing all of Azure. A lot of the capabilities in there are exposed through Lighthouse as well. And Andy, I really love your explanation on describing a tenant as the intra boundary, because that's the best way to think about it. Because all the objects within Azure that we think about, like subscriptions are associated to an intra tenant. That is what they roll up to. And you can move subscriptions between intra tenants, although it's messy and stuff breaks because now you don't have any identity specific controls you've built in. They all go poof and disappear as you make that migration. But it is technically possible to move a subscription between intra tenants. Now, just for awareness, if anyone isn't familiar with this, if you're not an identity professional, an intra tenant can, of course, be associated with multiple domains. So like top-level domains, internet domains. You can have both contoso.com and fabricam.com in the same tenant. So don't look for domain as like, oh, well, those are different tenants. Not necessarily. This could be more like, we need a tenant in the United States, and then we need a tenant in the European Union because we operate in these countries and they require it for GDPR or whatever. I'm making stuff up, but you get the point. I might have two entirely separate tenants, or maybe, Andy, you used to run into this all the time in manufacturing. I run into this a little bit as well. You have a lot of organizations where they like to operate in this model of, we have a central holding company, and then we have different business units, and each business unit actually runs its own tenant because they like complete autonomy. They want data segregation between them and other operating companies, and they don't want any of the data commingled. And so tenant design and architecture is always a sticking point when you're working with companies like that, because there's two schools of thought. If you put everything in one tenant, there isn't great data isolation. It's not, because the answer is, I want 100% data isolation. It's go build another tenant, because tenants have complete data isolation. That's the whole point. But if you want some data commingling, you want to all be able to work together, you want to recognize economies of scale, you put it all in one tenant. And so generally organizations, even when they are a bunch of different operating companies, I would say have leaned towards the single tenant model because of this. The data sharing has not worked very well. The ability for a central security department, if you have a global security division, as an example, that sits in the holding company part of the organization, they didn't have a really good way to have visibility into all the different tenants. And so this now helps them manage across multiple tenants, maybe multiple operating companies, with a single unified, not only SecOps interface, but a unified security team can look across all their different operating companies as well, or business units. So this opens the door for more architectures that might be better fits for some of those organizations that really rely on that model. And you mentioned M&A. a lot of those that like to keep everything separate in different tenants, they love that because it makes it easy to spin off companies. Oh, we spun them off. Well, they're already in their own tenant anyway. So they're already self-contained effectively. This enables you to do that. So if you work for a company that operates in this model, or you work with customers who operate in that model, this is huge because it really opens the door for more multi-tenant models than you've ever had access to before, where in the past you kind of dealt with the downsides of a single tenant model for that organization, even when it didn't completely make sense. So overall, really huge, opens the door for a lot of things. And there's more coming on this too. And Andy, you threw around terms like multi-tenancy as well as multi-workspace. Another thing that's coming soon is multi-workspace support for Security Copilot. So if you've been working with Security Copilot today, you can only have one single instance for the entire tenant it lives in. And that can be difficult if you have different teams that want to manage their own security compute units, which is how Security Copilot is built. There's this concept of a compute unit that is a consumable item, object, if you will. And so you've had teams where they're like, well, I want my own security compute units and I don't want to share with them. And that hasn't really been possible today, but will be in the future. That's different than this, just to be clear. But just to emphasize the fact that we're really focused on delivering the ability for organizations, whatever model they want to operate in, that we have technology that can snap to that. So this is really positive. And again, it sounds like very little downside, Andy. When you walk through it, you're like, yes, advanced hunting works. Yes, this works. Yes, that works. Like it's all there and it's all pulled together. And you don't have to do duplication of data, which is huge, because that kind of used to be the answer is, oh, well, you want this all visible in one place? We'll stand up one Sentinel to rule them all and ingest everything from all the other Sentinels, and then you can have it all in one place. And it's like, well, that's kind of gross. And now I'm paying twice for stuff. And we're like, well, yeah, that's what you got to do. Well, now you can reason all over it with the data in place, which we've talked about in other use cases is always a recommendation. Instead of duplicating data, keep data where it already lives and just reason on it there. And now you have the ability to do that. So that's really positive. So overall, I'd say a lot of upside, very little downside, and opens the door for a lot of different architectures that maybe really weren't on the table because of technical limitations. So that's really positive, is to where technology is not the limiting factor. It's more what's the best fit, what's the best architecture for your organization. And getting to that is probably the most exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's our show for this week. We'll put all the links to these blog articles of the announcements, configurations, all of that we can provide for you. And so you can look that over and start testing in your own environment. Hopefully you learned something today, and we'll continue to give you these announcements as we learn them, of course, because this is exactly what we do for our customers. We often will learn of new things and then share them out. So you're getting the firsthand look right here. All right. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.